it's that sort of reluctance to actually say that we're in a dire situation that is part of the problem. And Gerald of Wales visits Canterbury and says that they had 13 courses for dinner.
And how are these English churches getting in debt to Italian merchants? What's going on here?
There's a really interesting sort of theory that I'm sort of positing, which is that
English churches completely indebted to Italian merchants. That's what we're going to be talking about today with our guest, Luke Daly. And I apologize, I'm under the weather, but the episode has to be released. This, the 24th and final episode of the Just Feudal Things podcast. That's right, this is the final episode, as I'm going to be rebranding it to just the Memory Medieval podcast. I'm going to go into that here. Thanks for listening. Got a great conversation coming up for you here. And the 24th episode, that means this is the completion at 2 episodes a month of the entire first year of the Just Feudal Things podcast. I'm going to rebrand to the Memory Medieval podcast because that's what it's showing up as on Spotify and Apple Podcasts already. Even though I wanted it to be the Just Feudal Things podcast, there's a little bit of a tricky way with the way that it brands between Substack and the other platforms. And so it sort of has been something that either I need to switch or I need to actually make the Memory Medieval podcast, which was the intention when I first started. But I've had so many other things going on and so many things that I'm building, including custom medieval playing cards that'll be coming in the first quarter here of 2026. I've got all of these podcast episodes on Richard the Lionheart that I'm putting together. I've got curated trips to Europe that I'll be guiding people to go see, probably some Norman sites, maybe some cathedrals. I don't know. Stay tuned for that. As well as just on Substack, we have launched the beginning of a medieval history magazine. We want it to be physical eventually. It's going to be a digital publication for now. So the links to that will be in the description if you want to check that out. Feigned Flight magazine. And I think it's going to be a banger. It's a very unique concept of conceptual explorations of medieval history. Anyway, the point here is that I've had a lot going on and I just haven't had the ability with all of these other things ramping up to be able to really get to what was the flagship podcast vision. Originally, when I started, what I wanted to do was to create something kind of like hardcore history, but as biographies for medieval figures. I still would like to do that, but it's pretty clear that it's going to be a few years out at the very least. So I might as well have some congruence between what's going on here. And then when I get to that in the future, maybe I'll name that something else and we'll just have things sort of all make sense for everybody here. So this will be technically the last episode of Just Feudal Things. And the next episode, which is going to be a holiday special on medieval feasting, will be the 25th episode of the podcast, but the first as the Memory Medieval podcast. Christmas is coming up, so we have that feasting episode, but we also have a great sponsor for this episode, and that is Cards of History. If you're watching the video, you can see them on the shelf behind me right here. I have the Roman Empire set and Volume 1. There's a Volume 2 and an American history set. These are cards that have a picture on the one side with a sort of brief summary of whatever the person, place, or thing that the card is mentioning. And then on the back, it's got a few bullet points that give you some basics about it. It's great for somebody who loves medieval history or who loves history generally, would make a great gift. And I believe through our podcast at the link in the description, this is the only place on the internet that you can get 10% off. So if you have that history lover in your life and you want to support the show a little bit and save a little bit of money, boom, link is in the description. And I know I just talked about it, but I want to go back for just a second and say thank you, everybody, for listening to the podcast in the last year. It's got pretty close to about 40,000 total listens across all platforms, which is a great start for a first year. I want to thank all of the guests who have joined the podcast and been very gracious with their time and come on and had very interesting research, books, things to talk about. There's been a lot of great episodes, a lot of really interesting things to learn, including this one. I'm pretty excited for this conversation. And we just got over Thanksgiving here in America, and I just want to thank everybody for listening, for sharing, of course, thanking the paid subscribers on Substack and on X who support my work. And thanks to Renaissance Rewind for that banger intro clip if you're watching on video. And I just am very grateful for a great first year. I think all things considered, it's been an incredible success. And I know everybody's waiting to get into the episode, but it feels appropriate that I should express some gratitude to you, the listeners, and for everybody who's shared and supported the work. So thanks very much. I very much appreciate it, and looking forward to an even bigger and better 2026 and second year of the podcast. We're going to start it off with that episode on medieval feasting. And then I'm still working on 6 episodes in a row on Richard the Lionheart. Just has to be done. All right, so today's guest is Luke Daly. He's a PhD student at the University of East Anglia, where he's embarking on research into the financial records of Canterbury Cathedral from 1200 to 1300. Alongside this, Luke is the author of Women of the Medieval Ages, which is coming out in January, and Medieval Saints and Their Sins, A New History of the Middle Ages Through Saints and Their Stories, which came out in 2024 with Pen and Sword Publishing. And you'll find a link to that in the description as well. So now, without further ado, we're going to jump into the conversation about the rather unexpected financial state of cathedrals or Canterbury Cathedral specifically, and many others also in the 13th century. To begin to talk about your research, you had mentioned in a recent post a couple things that are pretty interesting, maybe a good place to start. You mentioned about how the sources, the financial records of Canterbury in and of themselves paint a pretty vivid picture, and how they allow us to reconstruct a history of inflation, commerce, institutional conflict, and administrative development. So maybe you could tell us a little bit in brief about your research, what kind of stuff you're doing, and maybe we'll jump into some of those in greater depth.
Yeah, definitely. So my area of research that I'm doing a postdoctorate on currently is a set of financial records, as you say, from Canterbury Cathedral in the 13th century. So it spans slightly before. It's 1198 is the earliest that we have, and it goes on. So I'm going up until 1285 because that's when you have the ascension of a chap called Henry of Eastry, who is sort of a real milestone in the history of Canterbury as this sort of everything after that is just flourishing, but then sort of a decline, and it's been written about extensively, but not much has been done on the accounts before that, primarily because they were first discovered sort of in the early 1900s by the student of a really famous historian, David Knowles, and that student, who's R.A.L. Smith, tragically died during their analysis of it. So they produced, I've actually got it here, a very small analysis of the beginning of the accounts, but then they were sort of lost. So a few historians have sort of looked at them over time, but only ever sort of superficially and only ever talking about one sort of small aspect of it. They were sort of lost until a digitization project brought them back to life. And then that's where sort of I then came across them, really. So they're sort of a general account. They don't go into a lot of detail. So, for instance, they say, for the cellarer who's in charge of the food and the produce of Canterbury, it will say that he spent £300, but it doesn't have massive detail about what that actually involves. But it does have a lot of information about loans, about debts, and sort of a general overview of the financials of Canterbury, which sort of, as we were saying, is really interesting and has a lot to do with inflation and the context of the time, and sort of really understanding, okay, so for a religious community that's focused on theology, how competent were they in business, in finance, and sort of looking at sort of the business behind the cathedral, really.
So, as a quick aside, before we dive into the details here, it's gotten me thinking because I did another podcast episode with Dr. Emma Herbert Davies, and she read some scrolls, if I recall correctly, that she said nobody had read for 500 or 600 years. How many documents are, I mean, I realize everybody can't go through everything, but sort of like what's, if you just had to, I guess, ballpark it, what would you say is sort of like our knowledge of things relative to how many things that we have, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, definitely. It's the thing is that if I look at the UK, for instance, you've got individual archives such as Canterbury that has a whole host of materials. So my manuscript is close to 300 pages. Then you've got the British Museum, you've got the National Archives, all of these huge sort of repositories of material, and that can only really be that, you know, that at some point someone then put on a shelf, maybe only put in, you know, certain details, and no one's really then been able to look at it fully. So, for instance, you go onto the Canterbury website and it says, you know, these are the early accounts of Canterbury. So someone's categorized them, but that would be an archivist whose role is sort of the overall management of the archive. It's then up to then the historian to then come across them. But, you know, there's also, when you get into the looking at private collections, it's things like that there's just so much that we're yet to uncover. And even huge things like recently the person I'm doing my PhD under, Nicholas Vincent, recently discovered, alongside David Carpenter, another prominent historian, a new Magna Carta that was in, I believe it was Harvard or sort of the archives, National Archives, I think, over in the US. And you think something as prominent as Magna Carta, and it was just there, but no one had picked up on it really until they'd seen it. So there's a whole wealth of information, and it just takes someone to sort of really just sift through it, to be fair.
Yeah, it seems like there's just a giant amount of information, I guess, that's out there that I guess you need people to go through.
There is, no, definitely. And I think that there's also, I mean, there's a lot to say that there's a lot of rubbish out there as well, in terms of, maybe that's a bit cruel to say in terms of the value that it brings to historians, but, you know, we have so much information. I mean, let's even take the financial accounts. There's 300 pages. Admittedly, not all of those pages are of interest. There's quite a lot of it when going through it that you're like, okay, well, put that, you know, it's just telling the same story. So, you know, when you come across, you know, it's those juicy things you want to see, you know, letters or wills or, you know, those bigger sources that you look for, rather than maybe these sort of general, you know, Richard owes £3 to Stephen on the feast of St. Michael, that you're like, okay, well, that doesn't really tell me anything. Kind of, you know.
Yeah, so maybe you could tell me a little bit about some of your, I don't know, maybe big, I guess, or important or notable, I guess, things that you know, maybe some of the big things that we could start with that you've seen looking through these.
Yeah, so one of the, I guess there's a few really interesting sort of milestones historically to pick up on that are represented in the accounts. One of them is that in 1220 we have the translation ceremony and anniversary of St. Thomas Becket. So you see that the income of the priory quadruples, goes from about £1,200 to over sort of 3,000, close to £4,000. But of particular interest for me is more so the I guess the bad side, the damaging side, which is their debts and how much they owe and to who. So in 1256, there's just this fabulous sort of self-awareness of what a terrible situation they're in. So the treasurers write how they owe to Italian merchants, primarily Sienese merchants, close to 1,000 marks. They owe 300 marks to Florentine merchants. They owe 200 marks to Jewish merchants. They owe £700 to private friends. And so what you see is that, according to the treasurers, that about 47% of what they owe is a culmination of interest. So they've protracted these loans, say 2-3 years ago, and a sum of what is close to sort of 2,000-3,000 marks is then noted, and most of that is just interest alone. They try to pay it off as best they can, so they take upon an interesting strategy in which they say, okay, we're going to start borrowing loans to pay loans. So they start by borrowing from Florentine merchants to pay off Sienese merchants, because they're the people that they owe the most to, and that's the one where that you have that really high interest rate that's really building up. So they say that with their Sienese loans, they went from owing 900 marks to 4,500 in 3 years because of that interest. So they try to pay off that one first, but obviously the amount that you don't repay then gets a whole load of new penalties. So although they are able to pay off a portion, the following year it then builds up. And this continues to happen until they are basically bailed out by the Archbishop, who gives them £3,000 and pays off all of their debts. But it's that particular period in the late 1250s that's of huge value, because we know that for a long time that there have been debts. We know that, I think, I can't remember, it was a person, it was a chronicler in the Middle Ages of the 13th century that said, if we were to ban loans, then basically no cathedral would function. Everyone was doing it. So we know that there were these great debts, but we've never been able to put sort of figures to it. And so to have the monks actually write in their treasury accounts and say, we started off with 900 marks. After 3 years, we now owe 4,500 marks, and we can't pay it off. It shows that they were in quite the sticky situation. And then it's sort of tracing that back to see what caused it, how this happened, and the factors then contributing to that. It's a period of mass turmoil in England and across the continent, with not only with the papacy at war with Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, but also just in England alone, you have the First Barons' War, Second Barons' War, you have the expulsion of the Jews, you have tallages and taxes being implemented. There's a whole lot going on, and it's all then represented in these accounts, which are just, incredible.
So, that leads to the obvious question. How are these English churches getting in debt to Italian merchants? What's going on here?
Yeah, so there's a few... there's a really interesting sort of theory that I'm sort of positing, which is that there's a big correlation between the sort of choices and strategies that the monks are making at the turn of the century that's then impacting them 60, 70 years later. So one of those is is what's called domain farming and direct estate management. So you have, we've noted in sort of crops and agricultural prices that there's this level of mass inflation that happens from 1180 to 1230. So prices double, quadruple, and uniformly, and to be fair, successfully, the entire country essentially brings its estates under direct control. So previously, it might be the case that I would have an estate, I would be a landowner, and I would let it out to you for, let's say, £10 for your entire life. Now, obviously, that doesn't take into consideration any sort of inflation, because if you have a great harvest, you owe me £10. If you have a bad harvest, you owe me £10. So it got to the point where, because of this inflation and because of the dramatic rise in agricultural prices, the leasee was making more money than the landowner, because you would sell all your crop, but you would only still pay me that £10. So they said, we've got to put a stop to this, and we're going to take it all under our own direct control. So that was called domain farming, because then they could sell their own produce and they could then reap the benefits and the profits from it. The problem is that although you're reaping those benefits, you've also got the issue of that you then have to pay those expenses, which they hadn't done before. So previously, the maintenance of the manor would then be handed over to yourself, whereas I would now have to pay that. And when you have somewhere like Canterbury, which is a really huge landowner, they had manors in Kent, in as far as Ireland. They had some in East Anglia, just dotted around the country. It's then very hard to maintain them. So then when you look 70 years later, where now these manors are, as the Archbishop says, dilapidated, they then have to spend a vast amount to keep them going. And because they're dilapidated, those previous revenues are now decreasing quite rapidly. So a lot of the income was coming from these rents from manors, whereas now that's then dropping quite fast. And so that supplemented income is now dropping. So what do? They then borrow money to be able to combat that. There's then also the stubbornness of the monks themselves. So Canterbury is, since its sort of conception with St. Augustine in 597, has a long history of privileges and liberties granted to them by kings and the popes alike. So they have, the right for election, for instance. And this is a really prominent power that the monks have. So they have basically the right to elect their own prior and archbishop. The problem is that then when someone tries to infringe upon their rights, they will essentially fight to the death over it. So at the sort of slightest inconvenience, they'll then take the aggressor to the papal court, and they'll pay however much it takes to protect their rights and be able to sort of overwhelm their aggressor, as it was. The problem is that, again, with each succession that happens, they are obtaining more and more loans to be able to pay for their trips to Rome. And in particular with the Archbishop Edmund of Abingdon, they have a lot of tension and battles with him. And they protract a vast number of loans in order to pay for their litigations. He dies, and then they've now got to pay for a whole load more of litigations at the papal court for the succession of the new archbishop. So they're paying off old loans then whilst protracting new ones. And then you've also got so you've got the manners, you've got inflation. You've then also got these external pressures. So you've got that papal taxation. So throughout the 13th century, the Pope is implementing various taxes on the clergy of England to help pay for holy wars and crusades. So they'll say, okay, we need 1/10 of your income for 3 years, which is quite a vast amount at the end of that. And a lot of these English cathedrals and monastic communities are complaining to the Pope about it and refuse to pay. However, they're sort of steamrolled over. And then again, when you then cut to the 1270s, you see that they're paying about 6 or 7 different taxes that are imposed by the king as well as the Pope. So you combine all this together and you see that, again, these decisions and these battles that they were sort of fighting at the turn of the 13th century sort of come back to bite them towards the end, and that's where they really get into this dire financial situation, because essentially to plug all these holes, they borrow loans.
So I'm familiar with inflation now, how it's essentially just more money printing. What was causing inflation back then?
So it's sort of a complex one, because we only notice inflation in agricultural produce. So when you look at the wages, for instance, of the workers, they remain the same. And when you look at other sort of aspects, different historians have tried to look for, there isn't enough evidence to consistently show inflation in other areas. So we can only really focus on agricultural produce. Now, there's a few different reasons for the inflation, but essentially it's that sort of supply and demand. So it's the idea that with King John and and his sort of failures as king, puts a high demand and pressure on sort of the peasant classes, through losing wars and through, well, just going at war in general with France. You also have sort of a population increase amongst the peasant class. So there's obviously new demands there. And alongside that, you also have just a collection of bad harvests as well. So you see just this like big increase in cost of living. So it's sort of similar in a sense that you also then have what's called the debasing coinage. So in a similar way, they sort of reset and fiddle with the economics of it. Now, I'm by no means an economics person. I come from a history background, so trying to understand as well a period where they had a currency, but also you're looking at a time where there was also still trade, and they're sort of making things up as well when they go along. It can be very difficult to try and truly encapsulate what these things mean, which is why we put these modern terms on it. So you could argue that maybe it's not right to call it inflation, but this is just sort of, I guess, one of the difficulties that medieval historians have when sort of looking at the past, because take for instance domain farming. It just sort of appeared out of nowhere, really, and it was just a new system that they sort of then created and only then afterwards attempted to rationalize. So it can be very difficult in that aspect to sort of explain it, given the limited source material, and then also explain things that were very different to how they are today.
Yeah, that's fair. Did the Italian merchants, were they sort of shopping their loans around, or is this a result of the monks ended up going to Rome to prosecute one of their things, and then they're like, hey, there's all these merchants, why don't we start taking out some loans? And I mean, you may not know, is this loaning from the Italian merchants, is this a pretty widespread thing, or was this a pretty narrow thing?
So it's reasonable to say that in the 13th century and maybe even onwards, that the entire country of England was upheld and supported by Italians. It is entirely widespread. And the reason being is sort of twofold. One is that you have a decrease in the prominence of the Jewish community. So traditionally you had Jewish moneylenders, but because of changing sentiments due to the Crusades, they repeatedly get expelled, or taxes are placed on them. So they can't really amass the money that a lot of these people are demanding, essentially. You then have, when you look over then towards Italy, you have obviously the rise of the Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, Pisa become very prominent, then followed by Florence, as well as Siena. They then become sort of prominent financiers in the papal courts, which is then where the monks are then going over and contracting a lot of these loans. But then you get the reverse happening, in which essentially spearheaded by the king, in order to pay for things, he essentially opens the floodgates and lets Italian merchants pour in. Primarily, this is through those papal taxes that we're talking about. So maybe the king is granted that he may set forth a tenth of your income, and the Pope sends a papal legate to collect it. Now, obviously, these Italians know that, maybe they're not able to pay for it. So alongside the papal legate is also then a stream of Italian merchants who you can borrow from, but also who are there to collect the papal tax. So it's they're sort of demanding money in a way from themselves, but procuring vast loans in order to pay for these taxes and different things. So you then have this foothold that's created in England, and this then really takes off when you have what's known as the Sicilian venture. So this is when the Pope offers the crown of Sicily to the king, primarily to the king's son, Edward. And he says you have to pay within, I believe it's 3, maybe 5 years, a sum of 135,000 marks, which is extraordinary payment. And the king sort of realizes that he's unable to pay this. So he puts forth a bunch of taxes, but he also gets one of the bishops, I believe it's the Bishop of Durham, contracts about 70,000 marks in loans to Italians. And again, this is then when you see that floodgate open. All these Italians are then just sprawling throughout England, and there's just this, essentially, the economy is based on these Italian merchants and these merchant companies that are coming from Florence and Siena, and are relied upon. Basically, they're depended upon to function, because it gets that bad from both the king as well as the merchants, as well as the cathedrals.
So I was under the impression, apparently wrongly, that usury was banned for Christians in that time. But it seems like, which this is sort of why Jews were able to become so essentially prolific, because they sort of had that technical loophole and they were able to, be, I guess, whatever it is, special subjects of the king and do their usury as, whatever, a technical loophole. But it sounds like the Italian merchants are doing some usury themselves. Is that right?
Definitely so. And this is where, again, linking back to the financial accounts, where we can then get so much information from them. So you're right in saying usury was a sin. There has been, from the Third Lateran Council, all the various other councils as well, they all say usury is sinful. There's even one that says he who participates in usury should not be given a Christian burial. Now, this is really interesting then when you see in the financial accounts, the treasurers will write the amount that they protracted on the loan, as well as de usura, so the amount of usury that they then pay. Now, so this is obviously really interesting to show that there's sort of this separation between one of the most prominent cathedrals, obviously in England and the monastic community in Europe, and the Pope. So it seems like they're ignoring them. And there's clearly efforts to try and overcome this usury, because Henry III expels Italian merchants practicing usury in 1240, but a lot of them come back. And what you find is that in the financial accounts, suddenly de usura ceases, and they try to find innovative ways of masking the usury. So rather than saying de usura, they'll say de lucro. So they'll say for profit rather than usury. They'll say, you might find as well, 1 year, it'll say that they gained a loan for 100 marks, but in the following year, suddenly it's now 120 marks. And so they're just sort of making these new sort of contracts and loan agreements that essentially mask the usury. And that's sort of, again, it's indicative of the sheer dependency that they had on the Italians, primarily because the Italians were the only ones who could really foot the bill of the vast amount of money that the cathedral needed. And so they were, it sort of just shows how willing they were to take on this payment, really. And it gets, as we say, it gets so bad that they go from owing 400 marks to 900 marks to 4,500 within 3 years because of this usury. So it's there's this disconnect between Canterbury and the Pope, and it's sort of a lesson, I guess, in history, where just because we read that, at the Third Lateran Council that this law was set forth, that not necessarily it was followed by everyone. They certainly employed some innovative ways to get around it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've been, the podcast is not about my personal opinions, but I'm relatively critical of sort of the financialization of everything. And I was kind of under the impression that sort of started maybe at the end of the medieval period, kind of like with the way that Maximilian was kind of taking out lots of loans from all these various places, the Fuggers and all these other guys. But it seems, this is kind of shocking for me because it seems like it's happening way earlier. Is this kind of when it started, or is it even earlier than this, or what's going on?
Yeah, so it appears as though it's difficult to say because the earliest financial accounts that we have is from 1198. So we don't know about what's happening before then, but the accounts show that they are borrowing money. So you could argue that they were probably doing it long before that. Likewise, I think when certainly there's been this, when you look at sort of Jewish money lending, that's been happening for centuries before. But when you look at this sort of dependency on Italians, it's relatively new for this period because that's when you have the creation of the merchant company. So you have, before that, you have much smaller ones called just societies. But it's really in the sort of the 12th century that the what we call the Campagna, which is sort of family banks or a collection of merchants banding together and sort of spreading the financial load to basically amass much higher amounts. And so there's this real rapid development at the sort of the turn of the century in terms of economics and currency and the way in which these things are done, that sort of makes it really ripe for Italian merchants to develop into these bigger merchant company families that you will later see with, for instance, the Medicis, and these real huge oligarchical families. But certainly they do sort of originate around this time, for sure. And even within the accounts, you see that at the beginning of the century, there's just maybe a few named people, whereas by the end, they're starting to have these formalized society names, the Bardi, the Riccardi, and so forth. So there is a development in this period for sure, that sort of then later takes off.
So when you're saying company, I'm kind of under the impression that companies were started sort of later. I forget the first one, not the Dutch East India Company, but the one that's before that, which is several centuries later. Is this something different, or what? Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, it's I don't know if it's maybe a linguistic thing, but you have, as I say, societies that have sort of existed for a while, but they're quite limited in the way that they ran. So it'd be that essentially the debt is shared amongst those involved. So, for instance, let's say we formed a society and we maybe band together, we provide a loan of 100 marks. Well, if you can't foot that bill, then our society collapses. So it's very fragile, and you see a lot of those sort of issues occur. And so then you have the formulation of the Compagnia, which is the merchant company, which I guess probably later informs these sort of, as we say, like the companies like the East India Trading Company and those more formal financial companies. But in this period, they are very basic in the sense that it is just the term used for just the group of merchants that have banded together. And a lot of them often have subsections and different collections. So it's that sort of very fluid approach, but they call themselves companies. Often it is just a family and maybe a few friends chucked in. But they are amassing money over in Florence or Siena, oftentimes through buying and trading debt as well, and then going abroad, using especially wool imports. That's one of the biggest things that they sort of, through the king, they'll say that, in terms of paying me back, I'll take a sort of tax on your wool. And then obviously you have the likes of Venice that's then buying all that wool from England. And so it's this sort of circular economy that takes place. So it's a little different, I would say, to the sort of formalized companies that we see a lot later on, especially in that sort of age of sort of mercantile trade. But certainly it's potentially even the origins of it, for sure.
This may be a little bit in left field, but it seems like with all these Italian merchants coming into England, lending money to the cathedrals and the king and various other people, it seems like at the same time, the Templars were also doing a fair amount of their own banking. And if I recall, on the Third Crusade, Richard even brought with him, I forget what his name exactly was, Daly, who became the Grand Master of the Templars. Well, he was there, I believe, on the Third Crusade. How did they not have any banking relationship with the Templars?
No, they don't. The Templars never actually turn up in the financial accounts at all. There's one person which could be a Templar. They don't specifically say. They say he's a Crusader, but they do pay money to him. But no, they sort of acted in a different sphere. And I think, again, that sort of comes from the nature of the loans that they were getting. Obviously, a lot of the loans that they were getting from Italian merchants were for the papal court, to pay off those sort of litigations and stuff like that. And then it's also just the sheer amount of loans that they are sort of asking for. So yeah, oddly enough, they don't rely on the Templars or the Hospitallers at all, really. And but they do rely on a lot of what they call private friends, who are fellow sort of, a lot of them are within the royal court, and they sort of clock on to this being, I guess, more beneficial, because from sort of the 1260s onwards, they sort of switch towards these, what they call private friends. So a lot of the time these are sort of like the king's sort of steward, or the king's chamberlain, or the king's treasurer, or people in the royal court sphere who are sort of wanting prominence and gifting money to Canterbury on the basis of, they call it a loan, but often it's the sort of repayment is in faith and prayer, and and so they don't necessarily have to pay these people off, and they don't have to pay interest on them. So although they rely heavily on the Italians, they do begin to look elsewhere as they sort of see their situation become worse. But certainly, interestingly, they don't turn towards the Templars.
Maybe one last question about the finance stuff, and we can get into some of the other things. And it's it's a little bit unwieldy in the way that I'm thinking about it, but I'm sort of familiar with, in the later medieval period, how these Italian merchants and the city states were able to sort of loan money and essentially require repayment based on the fact that they controlled so much of the trade that if whomever didn't pay them back, they could essentially like collapse their economy or severely economically harm them. This is a much earlier period in England, and obviously England is much further away. Why? And I understand, of course, maybe from the church's perspective, from Canterbury's perspective, that this may not be an option for them. But let's say for the king, it seems like it would have been fairly simple for him to say, like, this is extortionate. We're not paying. Too bad, or whatever. What sort of is there maybe a system of honor, or what exactly is sort of keeping the enforcement of these debts? If that makes sense, like the way that, like, why wouldn't the king just say, you know what, this is extortionate, forget about it?
So he does. He tries to. So as I sort of said before, in 1240, he orders that all practicing Italian merchants should leave the country by this date, and attempts to expel them. And interestingly, it sort of comes back to that dependency, because in no less than in under sort of 10 years, they're basically all back, because the king is in dire need of vast funds. Lords and also Canterbury itself and other monastic communities are also in such need of cash that they need to sort of continue to borrow. So there is an attempt to try and say enough's enough, but unfortunately they are just far too tied to it. Now, in terms of then repaying, the Italians are also financing the papacy. So you have what's called Campsore Domini Papae, which is a title that's given to Italian merchants that basically are working for the Pope, essentially. Not necessarily in giving loans, but in becoming that vast network of finance, because they're able to collect these taxes that, these merchant companies span across Europe. So the Pope leans on them for its sort of administration and collection of taxes and so forth. So in exchange, they're able to sort of use the threats of the Pope to their benefit. So if you don't repay, then they take you to the papal court, in which, under threat of excommunication and interdict, you have to pay. And there's even the Archbishop, John of Peckham, is taken to court because he says, these debts he acknowledges how terrible these debts are that they have, and that they just cannot pay it. And he says, enough's enough. I cannot pay it. We just need to put a stop to it. And the Italian merchants take him to court, and the Pope says, you have to pay, or you are deposed, excommunicated, and I will place an interdict on Canterbury, which is so damaging that threat is just too much, essentially. So it's really using the powers that they've got, this sort of grip, not only on the papacy, but also then on the king and on the payee as well.
I'm sorry, I thought I was done, but this is just too interesting. I'm sort of familiar with how modern nation states spend too much money, spend way more money than they take in. I think it's probably fair to say that every nation in the world is in debt, or every Western nation, let's say.
Mm.
What do they need all this money for? Like, I'm kind of confused. I'm just sort of like, what is? I understand. I understand the usury angle, right? You take out a loan for 900, and then 3 years later you have to pay back 4,500 or whatever it is. That's pretty insane. But like, and you mentioned the farming. So the farming is it just from the farming, like, essentially, and then the prosecution from these essentially these trips to the papal court, that's it basically, and then it just multiplies through the. I'm just trying to wrap my head around it. I'm
Yeah.
sorry if I'm going around again. This is like pretty stunning for me.
Yeah, it's so yeah, you're mostly right there. So it's the thing that's interesting is that obviously a monastic community is a monastic community. It's not a business, so they run more or less at their income is the same as their expenses. So they gain just enough money to basically be able to pay for things like food and their clothes and soap and all sorts of stuff. The problem is that then anything beyond that just puts them, spending more than they can gain. So obviously, one of the biggest things is, especially at the turn of the century and turn of the 13th century, is privileges and liberties. So, for instance, in the 12 just before 1220, the monks are going to Rome to try and gain a new privilege that says they have, the absolute authority to vote in their own prior. So that then costs them money to pay for the privilege, but also to pay for the expenses. And you've also then got as well corruption. There's a big battle that goes on between the English clergy and the papacy, in which they say, enough's enough. When we're at Rome, the cost of us to bribe officials and cardinals is, too much. So the Pope says, okay, well, why don't you give us a stipend? And that means that we won't have bribery. And the English clergy sort of works it out, and they say, no, we'll stick with the bribery. It's going to cost us too much if we give you sort of basically an income to make you rich, essentially. So we would rather have that power. So there's a lot to do with power in this. Power to have these liberties and privileges, and power to sort of exert your control when you do then have these litigation and court proceedings that happen in Rome. So that's a big cost to the priory. Then, as you say, you've also got the cost of your manors to upkeep and also expand. A lot of them, archbishops and sort of monastic communities, are looking to purchase and expand their own sort of land-owning empire, as it were, to be able to gain, because manorial rents are such a prominent part of your income. You want to be able to gather more manors. That obviously costs money. You've then got then additional costs for the seals, for instance. So Richard comes to power as king. He has a seal, and then about 15 years later, he produces a new seal. So then you've got to get basically all of your certificates resealed with this new design, and that costs money. Everything costs money in this sort of period, and when you're only getting your income from the only sort of steady income that Canterbury has is from its manors. It also gets a lot of its income from pilgrim donations, but when that's heavily dependent on what's going on at the time. So when you have the civil war, obviously pilgrims can't get to Canterbury, and their income from that plummets. So they have a lot of incomes that are very volatile, and yet they have all these expenses. And so it is just sort of this recipe for disaster, where it's a monastic community that's run not really as a business, obviously, but the problem is that then they find themselves in more and more debt. they take on these loans, and then that then begins to spiral.
So to play the devil's advocate against my own opinion, I suppose, is it kind of the sort of the mass financialization of everything and these more elastic financial systems sort of the argument? Because, like you're saying, their incomes are very volatile under, let's say, this harder money system. It seems like maybe then if you have a little bit more of a flexible and elastic currency system, you can sort of ride those out without the collapse from tourism or the collapse of a few bad harvests and stuff like that. Is that kind of the argument, I suppose?
Yeah, definitely. There's a rapid development in sort of economics of this period, and currency, and that everything sort of to do with that sort of centralization and commercialization of sort of all aspects of society, really. And you've also got to remember that, sort of as I say there, it's a place of religion, it's a place of faith. It's not meant to make money. There's a lot of contention around that in itself, and so on one hand, there's a need to run your cathedral as a business, because otherwise you're not able to live, essentially, and run it effectively. But at the same time, your pursuit is to God and God alone, and any distraction from that is highly contentious. And even the Archbishop John Peckham says that the monks which are in charge of running the estates are susceptible to become demons, because they are away from the cathedral and away from God. So when you have that side of it as well to contend with, it's very difficult to, I guess, rationalize the sort of need for making a profit, essentially.
I'm glad you brought that up, because perhaps if anybody could weigh in properly on this, it's you. I've only just ran into you recently, so I don't know if you're familiar at all with my content on X, or Twitter. I have a post that I post up maybe like once a month or every 6 weeks or so, 2 months, every 1 to 2 months, where I post up some sort of cathedral and I say the people who built this weren't motivated by profit. The idea behind this is that they're not building the cathedral with the intent of flipping money quickly, obviously, like how we would think of profit, right? Like, oh, I want to make a lemonade stand real quick, or whatever. I'm going to flip some widgets. I'm going to do drop shipping. The way that we think of profit. That's not to say that they didn't make profits, of course, obvious disclaimers. But I, of course, get all kinds of people in the comments saying, no, it was all about money and power. These people were, the tourism, the pilgrimaging, the all these other types of things. Of course, what do you think they were selling indulgences for? I get loads of comments on what I would say are generally cynical views of this, although I may be incorrect. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, maybe the motivation for the church building and sort of that general profit. And feel free to correct me. I'm leaving it open here for you to just tell me the facts, lay it out for me.
No, well, there's perhaps the best example that I certainly love, and where actually all of my research sort of originated, was a research piece I did on the commercialization of saints. So Norwich, medieval Norwich, and Norwich Cathedral is a phenomenal example to use for all those cynics out there, because they essentially invented a saint in order to make money. So in sort of the 1100s, you have William of Norwich, who is a young boy that was martyred by a Jewish blood libel, which is sort of this ritualistic sacrifice. He was then taken to the cathedral and becomes quite a fairly prominent saint within Norfolk and East Anglia. And what's very strange about him is that all of his miracles ask the person to donate wax. So there's one woman that is afflicted with cancer, and she gets this vision from William of Norwich, who says to go to the cathedral and donate wax, and continue to do so every so often. She does it, but then after a while, she's cured, and she says, "Okay, I don't need to do it anymore." And William of Norwich comes back in a vision and says, "You sort of broke our bargain. I'm going to give you your cancer back, unless if you continue to donate wax." And this happens across a vast number of miracles. The reason being is because wax was very expensive. When we look at the financial accounts, we can see that wax made up most of the expenses of the sacrist. So in order to cut down your costs, you can ask your pilgrims to donate wax, which can then be used to run the cathedral. This is then something that's sort of seen in other places as well. Bury St Edmunds, there's a particular two guys there, Abbot Samson and Archdeacon Herman, who will allow you at the cost of a pretty penny to come down into this crypt and see the blooded clothes of Edmund the Martyr. So there is a commercialization of saints, of cathedrals, that definitely happens. Whether that's their intended sort of intended origin is difficult to say, because a lot of them, for instance, when we look at Canterbury, have a very, very long history. Canterbury itself was a milestone in sort of Latin Christianity, because it was St. Augustine, not St. Augustine of Hippo, but a different one, who was sent by Gregory the Great to England to spread Christianity, and landed in Canterbury, and that became the foothold for him to disseminate Christianity throughout England and Northern Europe. So a church was then built, and it grew over time, and it's difficult to say in their conception whether commercialization and profit was behind it. But certainly when you get into the 12th and 13th century, as there is sort of this era of currency and commercialization happening, that people do turn towards profit and indulgences and saints to be able to adorn themselves and their cathedral with lovely gold, and you see that across England for sure. Yeah.
So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that changing era of finance, I suppose. What exactly was all changing over that period, and what maybe a little bit of what you've learned or seen through that in your research?
Yeah, it's a difficult subject to delve into, because of source material that lacks. Because you're going from with currency. For a while, currency was just a symbol of control, for instance. So by me having a coin made in my image as king, it meant that those using it were sort of within my kingdom. And so on the lowest levels of society, a lot of the time, that sort of trade and bargaining and bartering remained. And then once you then have that, the development of, I guess, the kingdom, and at around sort of, in England anyways, with 1066, you then have these Norman influences that come in. And it seems like there's this general feeling, especially when you look at Scandinavia and the sort of transition for the Vikings into a more formalized state. It seems that currency is very intertwined with that notion of statehood and the sort of formation of a nation, as it were. So again, perfect example with the Vikings is that they go from this sort of agrarian society, and one of the first things they do is create a currency. So you see that sort of development happening around the sort of millennia mark. And then by the time you're in the 13th century, currency is then being more widely used. It's still not necessarily formalized because you have, for instance, we see in the financial accounts, you've got marks, but you've also got pounds, shillings, pence, farthings. You've also then got florins. You've got foreign currency being put into the sort of flow of things, and it's still a bit of a mismatch, but they're figuring it out and they're sort of formalizing it more. And that then develops, because there is this, as we sort of said, this sort of era of commercialization happening, and I think that's in part prompted by the Crusades, in which Europe and the Middle East is suddenly opened up. There's a lot more trade and communication going on. There's these development of these networks. Suddenly, for instance, when you look in England, you're not looking at a single small kingdom like the Kingdom of Wessex. You're now looking at countries. Same over in France. I mean, it's a little bit different to an extent, but you're looking at these bigger sort of spheres of influence, and there's sort of then this requirement for currency to develop, and more sort of financial policy to develop. And that's then when you have the rise of for instance, universities such as Oxford, that then are not there to teach theology, but now there to teach business. And you have the creation of new texts at the end of the 13th century. One of the most prominent is Walter of Henley, which is all about estate management and how to run your estate, how to financially sort of make it stable and grow and expand. And so there is this sort of, in the 13th century particularly, this transition in administration and financial strategy. And you see that in the accounts as well. The accounts of 1198 are very simple. They're basically there for accountability rather than accountancy. So saying that, okay, X person spent this amount, but there's no real detail behind it. When you cut to the end of the 13th century, these accounts for a single year are now pages and pages long, because they've got information about every single aspect of the cathedral and their finances. And so you're seeing this real transition and this sort of financial awareness, I would say, that happens during this period, that is definitely not necessarily seen before that time.
Very interesting. We're coming up on an hour here. I don't know if you are able to go a little bit longer. I'm sorry, I forgot to ask you at the beginning. As you mentioned, there's some commerce and institutional conflict and administrative development. I'll let you sort of take that wherever you think is interesting, and maybe tell us just a little bit about those.
Yeah, so it's, I guess, in terms of the sort of harking back to just sort of what I said in part there, is that there is a real sort of bustling, rapid development in the sort of centralization of finances, so and commerce and the economy. So during the 12th century, everything is sort of scattered. When we look at Canterbury, there's three main what we call obedientaries, which is officials. So there's the cellarer, the sacrist, and the chamberlain. They have control over their own finances and their own expenditure. Often they have their own seal, which means that they can essentially do whatever they want without the permission and the acknowledgement of the abbot or prior, or even the wider convent. The problem is, again, when we return to Bury St Edmunds, there's a fantastic sort of source which shows that the sacrist had contracted some loans from a Jewish merchant from Norwich called Benedict, and was unable to pay them. And it wasn't until it was essentially taken to the king that it was discovered that he went from owing £100 to £1,000. And he just sort of kept sweeping it under the rug over and over again, and no one else knew. And until then, essentially, it was revealed, and the abbot wanted to depose him, but was persuaded not to. And this is happening sort of across the country, and there's then a real need for, especially when you look at greed and corruption, again, kind of tying back to that theology, to then have more of an oversight and essentially form more of an institution behind the monastic community. So that's when you have the creation of the treasurer. So Canterbury is actually sort of a pioneer in this. They create the treasurers in the sort of 1170s, which is quite late when you sort of think about how long the cathedral had been running, since sort of the late 500s. So for 500 years, they were without a treasurer or a central sort of financial office. But many other places don't have that until you have a chap called John Ferentino, who's a papal legate who comes over to England in 1205 and sort of is bringing over lessons learned from how the papacy do things, because the papacy, for such a big administration, needs to be at the forefront of sort of process and how they sort of record documents, disseminate them, etc., etc. So he creates a treasury at York. So they didn't even have one until 1205. And he says, okay, you need to have two treasurers, and funds all need to go through them, and they need to be autonomous. It must be that all expenses and receipts must go through them, and that they you have to ask permission to do it. So it's all these sort of rules and regulations that are then sort of instilled. And Canterbury adopts these. And that's also when you see this rapid development in their financial accounts, in terms of that level of detail and the way that they're formulated. And this is really what you would then call that sort of rise of that sort of institutional and centralization of the economy. And it's something that is then transitioned over to secular lords. So interestingly, it was actually the ecclesiastical side of society that developed its economy first, and then imposed that across to the secular. And we see that at the Council of Oxford in 1222, when Stephen Langton, the Archbishop, basically sort of explains how people should be running their finances. And a lot of these then experiments and lessons are then accumulated by various different people and landlords and nobles towards the end of the 13th century. And that's then when you get this great production of literature, in which you sort of now have manuals and guides on how you should run and finance things. You have people such as the treasurer of John of Peckham in the late 1270s, who is an Italian, and he brings over those practices that they're doing at the papal court and shows. It's a lot of show and tell, basically. And so you have this real sort of transition and period of evolution that then happens. And then from the priorate of Henry of Eastry, who was actually formerly a treasurer, he then rapidly sort of changes. He rapidly changes things, instills the monks with now this sort of financial and business acumen, and then the cathedral then begins to actually make some money and dig itself out of the hole, before then later declining anyways and collapsing again. But for a time, it gets better.
There's sort of a trope, I suppose, a common saying that, the church was sort of all powerful. It was insanely rich and all this stuff. What you're telling me, at least about Canterbury Cathedral and maybe even the Church of England, sounds like they were running on pretty slim margins and that they were not quite so wealthy. Is it maybe just essentially the papacy that was very wealthy? Or is this sort of is it highly variable? Is this a misconception?
I would say that for the papacy and Canterbury and cathedrals of this time, that there is a outward perception that they attempt to show, which is that everything is sort of hunky-dory and everything's fine and we're making money. But there's countless sources internally which show the opposite. And you see that at Canterbury with its admission that it owes so much money. You see that in, as we say, with Bury St Edmunds, another monastic community, where they also say that they are running out of money and having to cut down on spend. We even see that, actually returning to Canterbury, that the Archbishop is actually pleading to the monks that they eat less so that they can cut down costs because it's got that bad. And so when you think about, in sort of the sort of medieval imagination, when you were to enter a cathedral, and you would see a shrine that was adorned with gold, and there would be all these candles and this liturgy and all these monks that sort of, it was this great worship and veneration of God, that actually really behind the surface there was a lot of uncertainty and actually a bit of sort of worry about actually whether they could fund all this. And this is even seen with the papacy. The papacy is asking through its taxes, pleading to the English clergy, to the French clergy, saying that we have no money, we need your help, and we're asking for these payments because they're also extending themselves with the crusade and with these different things. And it's definitely an interesting sort of overturn of this, as we say, this belief that they were all powerful. And in many ways they were, because the papacy was able to, as we say, like when you think about how far Italy is from England, but the Pope was still able to make sure that they paid through threat of excommunication and interdict. So there was this sort of fear that was there. And oftentimes the monastic communities tried to say, no, we can't pay these taxes. But many times they sort of, after sort of raising their voice of displeasure, then do pay because they know they sort of have to. So it is sort of, it's a financial storm on both sides of the ends, really.
I find this very amusing because throughout my study of history, I feel like my diving into medieval history, I find so many similarities between what happened then and current events of today, things that are happening today. It makes me think of, like you're saying, they sort of have, they have to exude this perception of infinite wealth and power, because through sort of this perception of infinite wealth and power, then, everybody sort of goes along with the assumption that they have infinite wealth and power. And it kind of makes me think of like the stock market, how we have to give everyone the perception that the stocks are going up, because everyone will behave with the perception that stocks are going up and they'll put their money in the stock market, And so that it's like you have sort of this like infinite perception of like, no, everything's great. These companies are killing it, until the moment that they're not. And then there's a giant reversal. So it just strikes me as that there's a lot of similarities with that sort of behavior of like, we have to keep up this perception, because this perception sort of keeps things in place for us for a certain period of time. Even if behind the scenes, it's like, dude, we have no money, now we owe 4,500 marks or whatever it is. Just really, I find that sort of thing just extremely fascinating, sort of the parallels between things that happened 800 years ago and today, like that.
And it's also that perception that's also their downfall in a way, because and as you say, like today, I mean, it's that sort of reluctance to actually say that we're in a dire situation that is part of the problem. And you see that in the 1170s, where Gerald of Wales visits Canterbury and says that they had 13 courses for dinner. So this is in the context of inflation, of loans being protracted, appeals to Rome, privileges being purchased, debts amassing, and they're having 13 courses. because of this sort of renowned hospitality that they apparently have. And the Archbishop says, enough's enough, we need to cut down on this. And the monks blatantly refuse and immediately take him to court. And they then protract more loans to take him to court to defend essentially their wrongdoing. And it is that idea of it takes them until 1156 to acknowledge that things are wrong. 56 years since records began in Canterbury, for them to actually say, do you know what? This is terrible. But the problem as well is, which is also the problem again nowadays, is that they're then bailed out. They're given £3,000 and they're finally in the clear for 2 years, and then they start borrowing again because that's what they know how to do. And it's that countless times they're bailed out throughout this history, whether it's from the king, from the archbishop, from whoever, private friends, for instance. And so they never really learn their lesson. And again, it's like nowadays, you just borrow more money. It's someone else's problem further down the line. And this is an economic practice that's been happening for a millennia. And that's what you see in these accounts, is that idea of just, we'll plug holes for as long as we can until we get bailed out, because it's inevitable.
Boy, that is incredible stuff. Their perception, the maintenance of this perception leads to their downfall. Man, that is, I can't stop laughing about that. I'm just thinking about how I keep hearing about, the United States, we're going to pay back this $33 trillion in debt, running at a $2 trillion deficit every year. I'm like, the math doesn't add up to me, but the perception is no, we're fine. Everything's fine. Wow. That is just, that's really something. So on my Substack, I have a little section where my paid supporters can ask a question if they'd like. And my friend here, Culture Explorer, he wants to know if there's anything today's churches can learn from the medieval ages in terms of maintaining positive cash flow and getting people to fill the churches.
Gosh, that's a very interesting one. I tell you, one of the things I'm really there's actually a working monastery up in North Yorkshire in England, and I've been burning to go to see what a sort of medieval institution looks like in the modern day, because it would be really interesting to see how similar it is. Because a lot of the time, when you look at sort of churches nowadays, they do have, they still have investments in various different sort of buildings. There's also a thing here, if you live within a certain distance to a church, sometimes you have to pay a tithe to it. Again, that's sort of a very medieval sort of cash flow. But again, there's this, then when you think about it, there's still that reliance on donations. There's always that sort of classic, in the UK anyways, there's this sort of classic idea that the church roof is always needing repairs and needs donations for it. So I think there's still that reliance on very volatile investments that have been inherited long since this age. But it would be interesting to see, especially with the rise of sort of government and also the sort of idea of church and state that developed in between these periods, whether there are new cash flows, I guess, that aren't prevalent in these manuscripts because they're not yet sort of looked at, really. Obviously, one of the main differences that I guess we do see is that back in the day, when you look at Cistercians and the Benedictines, there was a great investment in farming that I don't necessarily think is prevalent today. So Canterbury at the end of the century really capitalizes on sheep and sort of starts investing itself in the wool trade. So, but perhaps nowadays the church is investing on the stocks and stock market. So I don't know. I don't know enough about sort of today's churches, but from a pilgrim aspect alone, you can still see that continuity, that there is a reliance on its community to uphold its its cash flow.
Yeah, there's actually, I just found out last weekend, I think it was, that there's some Carmelite monks about 6 hours from me who are, they live out in the mountains of Wyoming, and they're building a Gothic cathedral, and they sell coffee. And what do they do? Sell coffee, build the cathedral, something else, I think. I was trying to go visit them, but they shot me down. They're completely cloistered, so you can't go visit. Nobody comes out there. They apparently live at the end of a 16-mile road. And I even had people commenting on my thing. Oh yeah, my friend tried to go out there and some of the ranchers almost shot him.
Oh my god.
So seems pretty medieval.
Yeah.
All right. So lastly, we'll wrap up here and I'll give you the final word. Appreciate you coming on, and we'll have a link to your book in the description if anybody would like to check that out. And please feel free, if you enjoyed the podcast, leave us a comment, put a review, and feel free to share it with anybody who you think would be interested. And I'd like to say thanks again for listening. Thanks again for supporting the podcast for the last year. It's been a really fantastic first year. If you would like to support my work financially, please consider becoming a paid supporter on X or on Substack, or check out the Cards of History. Links to those will be in the description. And don't forget to check out the Famed Flight magazine, which will be coming out very soon if you'd like to read a lot more about medieval history. And Luke, I'll leave you with the final word. If you want to tell us anything else about cathedrals and their finances, anything else from your research that maybe I didn't ask you a question about, or that you think would be interesting for people to know, I'll leave it up to you.
No, well, I mean, it's certainly we've covered quite a lot off the list, and it is such a fantastic topic, and sincerely hope that people enjoy it as much as I do. Often when I say to people that I'm researching the financial accounts of Canterbury, they sort of go a bit glass-eyed. But it is really a fascinating period, and if you do want to learn more, my book on medieval saints and their sins sort of touches upon this. It looks at sort of the history of saints within the church, and that is a big point of commercialization, especially in this period, in the golden age of monasticism that we call it. And it's sort of here that you see, again, these decisions to protect the church and to protect the papacy and protect that image. Saints are very much so tied to that and their finances. So definitely do look there. And then also in January, I do have a new book coming out, which is Medieval Women, a window into the lives of medieval women, which looks sort of a little bit differently at sort of what what makes great women of the Middle Ages so great, and how were everyday women overcoming their stereotypes. So it's been an absolute joy to research that and to write it, and again does touch upon the sort of commercialization and the additional responsibilities that a cathedral may have, because after all, if you're a nun and you become an abbess, suddenly you have to now run a business, and so how does one even go about that when you are not allowed education, for instance? So yeah, thank you very much for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure.